Hi everyone, this is the Hungry Math Professor here, and today I'm going to be discussing The Stranger by Albert Camus, which was published in 1942 and is a book that is actually sometimes taught in high school curriculums, or I first read it actually in existentialism class in college. Though when reading it the second time, I realized there's a lot that I had forgotten. This book is written in two parts. And in the first part, you meet this character, Merceau, who is the main character in this book, and you're struck by, well, for one, he at first maybe seems like a kind of boring character. The way Camus writes in this book, the sentences are extremely short and simple, almost staccato-like um, rhythm to it. And it sets the scene of this character who doesn't seem to have a lot of depth from the beginning, not a lot of interests, goals, or anything like that, just kind of simply going through life. And in the beginning, you are introduced, or his mother dies, and he seems, he just kind of like going to the motions and doesn't seem to be feeling many emotions towards his mom dying. He just seems like annoyed by the heat of the funeral and all the people he's going to have to talk to and all these kinds of things. And then he winds up going on a date with this woman Marie the next day after his mom's funeral. He seems to have a great time, and they go watch a comedy movie, and she winds up sleeping at his place. And at some point, this woman that he just started dating asks him, whether they're in love. And it's funny because they haven't been dating very long, so it wouldn't be unreasonable for Michelle to be like, "Hey, listen, we just started dating. I don't know if I'm ready to talk about love yet." But that's not how Merceau responds. He responds more like, I don't know, you want to get married? Are you in love with me? Or and at one point he says, I don't think I am in love with you. But he also doesn't seem like he thinks he's capable of really loving anyone per se, or it's just kind of indifferent. But if Marie wants to get married, then he would get married. It doesn't really make much of a difference to him either way. And Marie is sort of an unusual character because this doesn't seem to bother her. I mean, it bothers her a little bit, but then somehow she's okay, like with the fact that as long as he wants to get married, she seems like kind of excited, and she kind of exclaims out loud to Merceau and to the reader that, oh, I'm always kind of attracted to some bizarre people, and you fit that description, so perhaps this makes sense. We're also introduced to this character Raymond, who seems like a more traditional sort of seedy evil character. He is talking about his girlfriend maybe cheating on him, and he wants to get back at her some way, and talks about how he's extremely physically abusive to her and wants to give her what she deserves. Um, Beyond just that example, he just seems like the kind of guy who gets involved in, like, all kinds of bad things all the time. The kind of guy that, like, a usual character, a good character would just want to stay away from. But Merceau doesn't seem to be attracted to Raymond nor repulsed by Raymond's character. Again, Merceau just continues to be apathetic towards life in general. And so, Raymond asks Merceau if he wants to be his friend, and Merceau's just like, sure, like instead of saying yes or no with any kind of conviction, he's just kind of like, whatever, if that's what you want to do, then let's. And he even winds up, like, Raymond asks him to write a letter, like impersonating Raymond to his girlfriend to try to lure her into a trap. And Merceau is just like, okay, if that's what you want me to do, I'll do it. Again, he doesn't seem like he's getting any kind of like kicks out of doing this with Raymond. You can imagine a character who like finds this exciting, like finds Raymond exciting because he's doing all kinds of seedy things. But that's not how Merceau seems to see it. It's just like, whatever. Raymond came into my life. and this is what he wants, so I'll just kind of go along for the ride. And part of what makes Merceau interesting is just how apathetic he is. Um, Perhaps if the book was longer, you'd get tired of this character. I should say The Stranger is not a very long book. It's only 120 pages, and I'd say the type is in my copy is not very big, so it's very quick, easy read. You might get bored of this character if the book was too long, but in this short form, I would say he's quite interesting just because of how unusual of a character he is. You expect characters to be um, in a very simplified spectrum, you expect them to be either more of a traditionally good character, in which case they'd be repelled by Raymond, or more of a traditionally bad character, in which case they might be excited by Raymond. But instead, from Merceau, you just get this sort of apathy, this indifference, to the point where part one ends with Merceau killing this guy because because the sun was like too much in his eyes when he was approaching this character. I mean, I'm skipping some of the details here, but he winds up just kind of like killing this character for no particular reason. And it's not an accident in the sense of like he was on the beach and he just wanted to scare this character, but then he tripped and pulled the trigger or something like that. It's not like it was an accident of that sort where he was like a tragic hero. He's more or just like a tragedy, not a hero. Um, it's more like apathetically that he kills this character. But when he shoots the character once in this sort of apathetic, accidental way. But then when the character hits the ground, he shoots him four more times, which is also kind of confusing. If it was just like a complete accident, you wouldn't expect the character to shoot four more times. Anyway, that's how the first part ends. And then in the second part, it's dominated by Merceau being in jail and being under trial. And he meets this lawyer who Merceau doesn't like really spend much time thinking about what kind of lawyer he should have. He just gets the lawyer that, is provided him to him by the court. And the lawyer is trying to help him out. But again, constantly in the second part of the story, you see the lawyer and then the jury and then the judge and then the lawyer on the opposite side that's accusing him. They're all like confused by the character that Merceau is. You get the impression that if Merceau was like more of a bloodthirsty, traditionally bad, evil character, that all these people wouldn't have as much of a problem with him if it's not that they would want him to be this evil person, but they would understand him better if he was like more traditionally evil. But instead, Merceau is just kind of apathetic and they don't understand what to do with this. But his apathy for in the case of the lawyer and the judge and the jury and the lawyer on the other side, eventually this gets uh, construed by them as he's sort of even more evil than like your traditionally evil character. He's like a psychopath of some sorts, and he's not just like a bad guy who killed some person. He seems like he's on a different level, right? So instead of seeing Merceau as like this apathetic character, they see him as just even more evil than like your traditional murderer might be. And it's partly because Merceau never seems to even be strategic, right? You can imagine someone who really wasn't an evil murderer, but was strategic enough to come up with a defense or could coach his lawyer into, some kind of reasonable defense that might confuse the jury or the judge. But Merceau is again, it's just apathetic the entire time and doesn't seem interested in providing any kind of defense. In fact, what's interesting during the trial is Merceau is wanting, it seems like the only thing he's wanting is for the jury and the lawyer and the judge and things just to understand his point of view, to understand his apathy, to like see the absurdity of life that's inherent in the way that Merceau sort of carries himself. And instead, they just see it in this more black and white term. You're either a good person that wouldn't do something like this, or feel some kind of remorse, or made an accident, or you're this terribly evil person who doesn't care and is willing to just murder, on a whim, and doesn't see any reason to feel remorse, and shoots the guy four more times after supposedly accidentally shooting him because there was too much sun. You know, they see him in this very black and white way, and Merceau doesn't really understand that, and he starts to like ask these philosophical questions about like why should it matter if I grieved my mother properly to this case? Like why should that have any bearing on whether or not I what my sentence should be for this murder? Um, why should it matter who my lawyer is and how good my lawyer is? Why should these different details about Raymond and his friends and Marie and all these things, why are these bearing weight on on the case, right? And of course, from the judge's point of view and the jury's point of view and the lawyers, they understand that we have to paint a story about the kind of person that Merceau is, and we want to understand his character, right? They understand how a jury works, they understand how these trials work, and we want to have some idea of what Merceau's character is like. But Merceau is just so almost disturbed by the fact that they care about these things, right? It's interesting what seems to disturb Merceau and what doesn't. At the end of the trial, uh, he gets sentenced to death by guillotine. Now, this part of the story was surprising to me. It made me wonder, like, because again, the book was published in 1942, so it made me wonder, like, when did the guillotine become obsolete? And so I looked this up. It turns out that in France, the last time an execution by guillotine was conducted was in 1977, which was much later than I expected. So that's part of why in this book it does actually make sense as a form of execution. And in the last chapter, you see sort of the most philosophical chapter, I would say, where things kind of come together. What's interesting here, so now Rousseau is in a jail cell and he's waiting to see if he gets an appeal, which would actually could possibly make him live longer in jail, or could he actually get out? He's like considers all these things. But he's basically on his deathbed. If the appeal doesn't go through, then at any day he could find out that this appeal doesn't go through and find out that he's going to be executed by guillotine. And it's the first time where you see Merceau wrestle with the fact that he doesn't want this fate to happen. Um, Previously, when he's on trial, it's not entirely clear that it doesn't seem like to be thinking that much about the fact that he could be convicted and to the death penalty and things like that. So now you see him wrestling with that. You can tell he doesn't want that fate. He'd like to be able to live longer, but he's also like questioning whether um, that actually is worth something because you're going to die anyway. Should is it better to die of old age? Is it better to die of some random heart attack you can't predict? Or does it really matter if you're just going to die by guillotine in a couple days, in 20 years, in 50 years? What's the difference, like in the grand scheme of things, right? So he's really asking these kinds of questions that are in the uh, scope of what's being asked by the existentialists, but is very much being asked by Camus. How do we deal with the absurdity of life, which is the fact that we're going to die anyway at some point, and we can't be certain of any kind of meaning that the world has. But yet, the absurdity part is that we seem to take life so seriously, and we seem to care about every single day and moment and how we feel, despite the fact that we know we're going to die at some point, and that in the grand scheme of things, when we die and how long we live doesn't seem to have all that much weight. Um, and it's the rest of the world around Merceau who seems to obviously take life very seriously, but Merceau is the only character in the book that you can explicitly see who seems to understand the absurdity of it all, who seems to actually be grappling with the absurdity of it all. And he really grapples with this head on in the last chapter. The book ends with this chaplain coming to Merceau's jail cell and asking him if he wants to receive God or wants to talk about God. Why doesn't he want to have these kind of conversations? To ask, maybe ask God for forgiveness or something like that. And Merceau is just completely uninterested. And Merceau is taken aback by how certain this chaplain can be of his convictions about God and religion and the afterlife. And this is confusing to Merceau. In fact, to the point where he gets so angry with the chaplain at one point that he like grabs him by the collar, and guards have to come into his cell to like separate him from the chaplain. And right before the end, you see that this sort of like this scurry that he gets in with the chaplain inspires some kind of bizarre hope, this kind of absurdist hope. And I'll just end with this quote at the end. So he says, "So close to death, Maman, his mom, what he calls his mom, must have felt free then and ready to live it all again. Nobody had the right to cry over her. And I felt ready to live it all again too, as if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope. For the first time, in that night alive with signs and stars, I opened myself up to the gentle indifference of the world, finding it so much like myself, so like a brother. Really, I felt that I had been happy and that I was happy again. For everything to be consummated, for me to feel less alone, I had only to wish that there would be a large crowd of spectators the day of my execution, and that they greet me with cries of hate." What's interesting in this last chapter, he talks about how, like, no matter what circumstance you find yourself in, his mom would always tell him that there was always a way to find some way to be happy despite the circumstances. And in that last paragraph, you see Rousseau find a way to be happy in the most extreme of circumstances. He's in jail. He knows he's going to be executed by a guillotine, and he finds a way in this sort of absurd way to find some kind of joy in that moment. Um, I'm embarking now to read several more of Camus' novels, and then two of his essays where he describes his philosophy in more direct terms. So I wanted to come back and read this book. We're not going to answer any questions with this particular novel, but it sets the scene for this question of how we should handle the absurdity of life. The fact that in the big grand scheme of things, there doesn't seem to be any meaning to life, at least no meaning that we can be absolutely certain of. Yet we want to live every day as meaningfully as we can. We want to be happy. We want to find a way to enjoy life. Despite this fact, we seem to care and we seem to feel like it's important, despite this fact. And that's it's a very dark question to ask. But I think in these sort of deep, dark questions, I find interest just to see what we can say and whether we can find some kind of um, how we can find a positive way to you thread the needle through such a dark and difficult topic. Anyway, tell me what you think, like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope to see you at another video.